Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Jeff Nielson. Jeff is a writer, editor, managing partner of Bullion Bulls Canada. He's published approximately about 1,000 commentaries on mainstream news, precious metals websites around the world, and I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Welcome back, Jeff.
It's nice to be back, Dave.
Thank you for coming back. Let's get right into the economy. Now, we are seeing economic indicators like retail, housing, the auto industry, manufacturing, and most of these indicators are showing us that everything is declining. Now, when you look at the economy, what's your take on the economy at this point?
Well, for the longest time, I simply have dismissed most of these so-called statistics as exaggerations and in many cases simply fabrications. And I have a sort of a larger big picture overview here, which is that we're basically entrenched in these 8-year bubble and crash cycles that are being put together by the banking crime syndicate. And it was really another commentator that focused me on this a couple of years ago, a gentleman named Warren Pollock. And he put out an interview toward the end of 2014 suggesting that 2015 was going to be basically a setup year where we would begin to see indications of the markets topping and things turning towards the other direction in anticipation of 2016, which would be the end of the current 8-year bubble and crash cycle. And he pointed out how these 8-year cycles are deliberately timed to coincide with the US election cycle so that when the crash comes, the incumbent party can be banished as the so-called scapegoat for the crash, and then the other party gets to ride in and pretend to be the white knight, and then they just repeat the whole cycle over again. Tweedledum replaces Tweedledee, and you go on from there. And so I was expecting to see this deterioration in the reporting of the news, but for me, there's no particular new deterioration in the economy. I'm firmly of the belief that the U.S. economy and Western economies in general have been entrenched in a greater depression going back to 2008. And all that we've had in terms of so-called growth, quote unquote, in the meantime, are fabricated statistics.
They continually say that we're in the manufacturing rebound, and they're trying to convince us that manufacturing is picking up, it's getting better. Actually, they're doing this with housing, with almost everything at this point. Right now, from the records that we have, we've lost about, since 2008, somewhere around 1.5 million or so manufacturing jobs. And right now, at this point, I don't see manufacturing rebounding anytime soon. Is this a complete illusion?
I certainly think so. And of course, what we had immediately before this so-called rebound was just about 6 solid months of absolutely dreadful numbers coming from all of the U.S. manufacturing indices and related stats. And of course, once again, for me, that was just the truth being allowed to show through. So I look at this so-called rebound and I just ask myself, where could it possibly originate? There's no consumer strength to generate demand for higher manufacturing. The U.S. dollar is, of course, perched at this ridiculous artificial high, so there's no demand for U.S. exports internationally. So if there's no domestic demand and no foreign demand, where does the so-called rebound come from? It's pure illusion.
Going forward, do you see the manufacturing declining even further?
I don't see any way the general deterioration of our economies can be reversed without a complete overhaul of all of the policies that our governments are pursuing, and I don't see any possibility of that while the current corrupt incumbent regimes remain in place, because I don't, at this point, see any Western regime that appears to be interested in helping the people. They are all serving the banking crime syndicate and doing whatever they command in order to facilitate this bubble and crash crime cycle.
Let me just ask you, do you think the TPP that they're trying to push through, do you think this will help manufacturing?
Well, no, because, and here's something that I'm really disappointed in how it's being reported by the alternative media, because I think it has really let people down. And the big point to get across with all of this so-called globalization is that it's based on this utterly false premise that this is quote unquote free trade. And here, nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, I've studied economics, so I actually understand these doctrines. And of course, the mainstream economists are supposed to understand them as well, but they display no comprehension whatsoever. Free trade is based on a concept known as comparative advantage. And it's really a very simple premise. People tend to be better at doing some things than other things. Geographically, certain nations are more favorably situated to perform certain economic activities than other activities. So the premise behind free trade is you have different nations, different regions doing what they're best at, and then each sells to the other at what they're best at. But of course, in order for free trade to work, there has to be a series of other conditions in place. And what those conditions generally amount to is a perfectly fair and equal set of rules which all of the trading partners abide by. And it's only if that fair and equalized set of rules are in place that you can actually have free trade. If all of the supposed trading partners have different sets of parameters in their economies as to how they function, they can never mesh in a proper manner. And this is what we have. We have the only thing that's been equalized is the race to the bottom. They've erased all the borders and allowed the mega corporations to ship their goods to wherever they want. But there's been not even the slightest effort at all of harmonizing employment standards and environmental standards and all these other things that have to be in harmony in order for free trade to be functional. So we have this bastardized pretend free trade, which goes by the name of globalization. And like I say, it's nothing more than a race to the bottom, and it's based on a totally separate concept, which of course you should be familiar with by now, competitive devaluation. So instead of nations basing their trade upon what everybody does best at, the trading dollars tend to flow based on who destroys their currency the fastest and thus prices their exports the cheapest, who gives away their goods at the cheapest price. That's by definition a race to the bottom, and it can only end in the complete devolution of all of our economies. Globalization is a guaranteed recipe for the complete disintegration of the West and the overall deterioration of the global economy.
Let's move on to the stock market and precious metals right now. In the start of this year, we saw the market was down, and we see that it was pumped up, and a lot of people say it's manipulated, which I do believe it is at this point in time, very manipulated. And we also saw back in December of 2015, gold was around 1050 or so, and it has gone up about $200 or so at this point. And we've seen gold surge, and then we see it suppressed. What is your take at this point on what gold, the precious metals market, is doing?
Once again, I've been pretty clear in this respect in my writing. I consider this to be a fake rally. And it once again plays into the overall big picture that I've been describing. We've got a crash that's scheduled for this year. I expect it to come within the next 2 or 3 months. And the point is when the bankers trigger this crash, the last thing in the world they would ever want to happen is for gold or silver to be perceived as a safe haven. So it's a certainty that when all of these other markets are crashed, they will they will crash precious metals markets with them. But of course, the point is with silver back at 13 something and gold back at 1050, it's really hard to crash something when it's already sitting in an ultimate trough. So the idea is you march these markets up a little bit so then you can crash them. So this is the whole point here. In order to generate a really good crash in gold and silver, they have to raise the prices a bit. And so that's what's happening right now. And we can tell this is a fake rally simply by the fact that silver is not leading the way. In a real precious metals rally, silver always leads the way higher, and it's a simple function of arithmetic. The gold market by dollar value is so much bigger that it requires only a tiny fraction of the same amount of capital in the silver market to cause a bigger price increase. And putting that into specifics, with the current gold-silver price ratio at an utterly absurd 80-to-1, if even 2% of the money going into the sector was going into silver, silver would have to lead the way. And that's just a matter of arithmetic. So when we see this so-called precious metals rally where gold is leading silver higher, it's obviously a fake rally because there's no rational scenario where we could see more than 98% of all the money going into the sector going into gold and less than 2% of all the money going into silver.
You mentioned something where you said crash, and you said in 2 to 3 months. Just explain what you mean by crash. Do you mean the economy crashing or the stock market crashing?
Well, it's going to be either completely simultaneous or it will be one immediately ahead of the other, with whatever comes first being blamed for whatever comes after. So, the scenario is that everything has to come down. The economies have to be crashed, the markets have to be crashed, then they can do their reset and do their next 8-year bubble and crash cycle. At least that's the general plan. Although, when I look at the overall parameters, I don't see how our governments and our economies ever come out the other side. So I've begun to refer to this next crash as the last crash because I don't think our system can survive in its present form.
I just want to be clear with everyone listening. When we have this crash, you're saying this is the crash that is coming?
Yes.
How bad is this crash going to be?
Well, you hear some commentators talking about a quote-unquote deflationary crash. Mm-hmm. And to me, this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of both history and economic fundamentals, because what they always refer to when they make that prediction is the Great Depression. And the point is that the current economic parameters are totally different than the parameters that existed in our economies at the time of the Great Depression in some very important respects. The most important respect is that when the Great Depression hit us, we had, up until that point, healthy and strong and solvent economies. And the importance of this is that in order to weather any deflationary trough, a government and an economy requires some sort of reserves and savings that they can cannibalize to weather that downturn and emerge on the other side. Without the ability to cannibalize savings or other reserves, there's no means of surviving the downturn except to do what our governments are currently doing right now, and it's just print, print, print. So what we're going to be seeing is a severe downturn in our economies, a severe downturn in our markets at a time when our governments are already, charitably speaking, on the verge of bankruptcy. So there is no reserves of any kind to cannibalize, yet government revenues are going to take a massive plunge, of course, with all of the other facets of our economy taking a dive. And so there's going to be this incredibly huge surge in demand for government services to help people survive the trough. At the same time, there's a huge crash in government revenues, and our governments have zero savings. So all that means is that the current money printing shoots up another order of magnitude higher, and we have a word for that. It's hyperinflation. So this is the whole point. A deflationary crash is impossible because we can't survive it. If a deflationary crash starts, it will immediately morph into hyperinflation because the only way for our governments to avert literal bankruptcy at that point is print, 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 and print some more. An order of magnitude higher than the money printing. And for people that have been following my work and looked at the chart I post all the time on US money printing, that's a chart of a currency that has already been hyperinflated. The US dollar has already been hyperinflated. We're just in the reality gap between when it becomes fundamentally worthless and when the chumps actually realize it's worthless, and then of course the exchange rate falls to zero. So, and of course other Western currencies are just a derivative of the US dollar, so they're basically fundamentally worthless already now. So our currencies are already worthless, and then our governments are about to print them at a rate that's even more unprecedented than what they've already been doing.
So are you trying to tell me that the president who came out and told the world that the economy is absolutely fine, are you saying that he's lying?
Gee, I don't want to shock your listeners too much, but yes, I think it's possible that one of these politicians might not have been telling the truth.
What is the everyday person going to, I mean, is the market going to come down like 2,000 points, 5,000 points? And when it does come down, my next question is, how does this affect the everyday person?
Well, here, of course, we have to delve deeper into the whole hyperinflation scenario. And because what's so crucial here, of course, is that once a hyperinflation cycle really starts to evolve, prices become surreal. So we could see nominal prices going, up steadily, even up sharply after a brief downturn, depending on how aggressively and how quickly the governments switch into hyperinflationary mode with their money printing. So, in real dollars, in terms of I mean, that's almost a surreal term itself. In real wealth terms, the value of our markets and of course our economies is going to plummet. But in nominal terms, depending on how quickly the government shift into hyperinflationary mode with their money printing, we could see prices go in any direction. The thing that people have to realize is that you cannot view prices in absolute terms separately. You have to be totally focused upon the level of money printing and then relate that to prices and then see for yourself if the hyperinflation cycle is already started. Because, of course, if the money printing escalates by an order of magnitude and prices start creeping higher, we could still be in a crash scenario. It's just a matter of proportionality here.
Are we going to see huge layoffs like we did in 2008?
Well, we already have such severe permanent unemployment that it depends on how aggressively the oligarchs who are working behind the scenes here are willing to take down our economies. And of course, here we have to look at all of the fascist government machinery that's put in place alongside our so-called war on terror. If our governments were wanting to prepare for massive civil unrest, they couldn't have done a better job than with all of the authoritarian machinery they've put in place in terms of surveillance. And of course, in the U.S., you have all of these gulags that have been built that are currently sitting empty. And, you presume the U.S. government didn't build this housing for millions of people in order for it to sit empty year after year after year. They plan to put people in those cells.
So when this whole thing starts to fall apart, will precious metals rebound, and will that start moving upward?
Well, once again, we're dealing with a level of surreality here because, as I've been explaining, prices in nominal terms are already somewhat meaningless. They of course have meaning in terms of our immediate exchange rate for various goods and services, but beyond that, they're totally artificial. So, as I was saying a little earlier, I expect precious metals markets to be taken down very sharply with everything else. But the point is, of course, once again, we're talking about nominal prices. Gold and silver are hard assets. No matter what the bankers do, no matter what the level of corruption, they can never be destroyed. They can take the nominal price to, down to 1 cent a piece, up to $1 million a piece per ounce. But those are just nominal numbers. At the end of the day, when you're holding your gold and silver, you still have your ounce of silver, you still have your ounce of gold. And when rationality returns to our economies, we know that these are assets of value. This is what makes them such perfect money, is they have aesthetic appeal, they have massive industrial usage, and of course they have cultural appeal. So this is why for 5,000 years, humanity has been able to trust gold and silver as safe vessels to store their wealth, because no matter what occurs in the future, there will always be demand for these metals, thus they will always have value, thus they will always preserve wealth. So our paper currencies are going to zero. That's a given. That happens to all fiat currencies. That we have 1,000 years of history that proves that. So whatever wealth people have stored in paper is going to go to zero. That's inevitable. Conversely, whatever wealth they transfer out of paper and into gold and silver will be preserved more or less in its entirety.
At that point, will gold and silver be very hard to acquire?
Well, to some extent, silver is already becoming hard to acquire. Of course, we have our national mints rationing their sales. And what makes this so amusing is, as you probably realize, the U.S. Mint is bound by a law, U.S. law, to keep the market fully supplied at all times, period. No matter what demand is for U.S. minted coins, the U.S. Mint is required by law to produce enough coins to satisfy that demand. So all of this allocation that the U.S. Mint is talking about is a violation of the law. Well, why is it violating the law? Can it not get enough silver? Or is it just violating the law deliberately? And of course, here the point is, and another commentator pointed this out to me fairly recently, this law that binds the U.S. Mint originally required the Mint to use only U.S. produced silver. And of course, the reasoning there was to support the U.S. silver industry. When it became obvious that the U.S. silver industry could not meet the demand of the Mint by itself, the law was amended to allow the Mint to import silver from Mexico, which is the largest silver producing nation in the world. So the law was deliberately amended to supposedly give the U.S. Mint access to all the silver it could possibly need, and yet it's still rationing silver. Why? Nobody has an answer to that question that is legitimate.
So how does the yuan-based gold price fix in April change anything? Will this change anything for precious metals?
No, not immediately. But at the same time, I'm firmly of the belief that China, and along with China, Russia, are already planning to resurrect a gold standard-based economy once the Western-based system collapses. And to that respect, both China and Russia have been accumulating massive reserves of gold, both openly and in a clandestine manner. But the point here is that we can't see any official move from the East to back currencies with gold or talk about resurrecting a gold standard until the transition from the US dollar to reserve currency to the renminbi as reserve currency is completed. And the reason why we can't see any gold backing prior to that point is if there was ever a scenario where the marketplace was given a choice between a worthless paper unbacked US dollar and a gold-backed renminbi, we would see the greatest financial stampede in history out of worthless US paper and into the valuable renminbi. So we could never see China officially back its currency with gold before the transition to the renminbi is complete. And of course, the transition is mostly complete now, so we don't have to wait too much longer, but it still has to be fully complete, and only then will China feel economically safe enough to begin to work on an honest money standard and some form of gold backing for its own currency.
So once this occurs and their currency is backed by gold, the dollar is, at that point, kind of worthless.
Well, this should be no surprise to anyone, since we've already had the bankers engaging in musing for several years now about what would be an alternative reserve currency, quote unquote. And of course, the trial balloon that they continually toss out again and again are the so-called SDRs of the International Monetary Fund, their special drawing rights. Right. And what makes this so hilarious is this isn't even a currency. This is just a essentially, line of credit that is offered by a institution of dubious legitimacy. And we're talking about making this an international currency for commerce. The US dollar, of course, is a fiat currency, and in that respect, it's fundamentally worthless like all fiat currencies. Then we have the evolution from that of the euro, which is a currency which isn't even based directly on any particular economy, but it just represents a zone in some nebulous fashion. So that was another sort of level of surreality in our devolution of these currencies. And then, of course, we have the latest trial balloon, which is these SDRs, which totally, blurs the meaning of the word currency completely into something that's totally nebulous. It's just a number in an account, and that's all that a currency has to be anymore. And of course, as our governments race to ban cash, this makes this whole system even more surreal. Everything is just going to be numbers in a computer file, and they're going to call it a currency, or they're going to call it whatever they want to call it. But it's just, if the Western bankers have their way, a totally surreal system with no reference points to reality of any kind.
So you mentioned cashless society. Do you think at this point, since you're telling us that we're going to be crashing in a month, 2 months, or 3 months down the line here, and we know they're pushing negative interest rates because we know Europe is a negative, Japan is a negative, except for the United States, where the Fed decided to increase the interest rates by 25 basis points. But now they're talking about negative interest rates. But we see that Larry Summers, Draghi, they're talking about getting rid of cash at this point. Is this why they're going down this path? Are they very nervous and they want to speed this up because what is about to happen here and out in Europe, where the whole thing starts to fall apart, and they want to keep all the currency in the banks?
There's a number of motivations for the war on cash. Yes, part of it is security. They looked at what happened in Greece, and as soon as the Greece
Hmm.
people saw what was being done to them, they ran to their banks and then they were told they couldn't get their money. Well, of course, that obviously creates a lot of anger and unrest. Well, if you simply create a system where nobody's ever allowed to pull out their money, you solve
Hmm.
that problem. But the other side of the coin, of course, is when you talk about negative interest rates. And I mean, the first point to realize, and just we back up here, is that a 0% interest rate is by definition fraud. If you were to ever engage in any so-called 0% loans, quote unquote, in your own personal affairs, and then you report those transactions to the IRS, in a matter of days, you'll get a notice back from them telling you that your so-called 0% loans are sham transactions, that they will be deemed to be what they actually are, gifts.
Hmm.
So when the U.S. has had this so-called 0% interest rate at the Fed for all these years, this was by definition fraud. And what, of course, the Fed was doing was simply giving free money to Wall Street by the trillions, more fraud. Now we're going to negative interest rates, and negative interest rates are an order of magnitude more fraudulent because, of course, it's based on the premise of borrowers stealing from lenders. Negative interest rates are open criminality. A 0% interest rate is slightly disguised fraud. Negative interest rates are open stealing. So borrowers are going to steal from lenders, and then our criminal governments are going to force us to put everything into the banks so that we're essentially being held down for this financial rape by the bankers. It is fascism at one of its most extreme manifestations.
Isn't there a way, and everyone keeps talking about this, where they can continually keep everything going, where they can manipulate the stock market, continually suppress gold, pretend everything is fine, just like Japan? Isn't it possible that they have the ability to keep this economy going forever, just like this?
Not at all. And of course, Japan is a good example in several respects because uh, while we're essentially copying Japan with our policies, we started from very different positions. The Japanese economy started its 30-year depression with one of the world's largest pool of savings ever accumulated. So they had this incredibly vast pool of domestic wealth and domestic savings. And what makes that of note is that when Japan began running these huge budget deficits because it wouldn't put to death its too big to fail banks, it was able to self-finance a lot of this debt. It borrowed from its own people. And if you can finance your debt internally, then essentially the economy remains fundamentally viable. It is only when an economy must permanently finance from outside and has no way of ever arriving at a balance of payment that we know that this is a devolution towards implosion. And of course, we've been in this devolution ever since the gold standard was assassinated in 1971. We've seen the currencies debauched to worthlessness. We've seen our economies drowned in debt, and this was unsustainable when it was begun in 1971. So after 45 years of these radically unsustainable economic policies, yes, we are at the very end now, and it cannot survive much further. And of course, that's why I'm talking about the last crash now, because I don't see any way for our governments to come out the other side once we go down this time.
Do you think that they'll try to cover? I mean, who's going to take the blame for this crash? We know government doesn't like to take the blame for anything. We know the Fed doesn't like to take the blame for anything. So who's going to take the blame for what's about to happen here?
Well, now you're sort of getting into my deepest and darkest fears. And along with a lot of other people, I have speculated that there will be some major exogenous event coming. And the most likely candidate historically is that the banking crime syndicate will manufacture another war. And of course, with our current paradigm, very likely this will be there'll be some sort of terrorist false flag event as the pretext, and then the war will mushroom from there. The other scenario, of course, is that, as I'm sure you're aware, the neocons within the U.S. have been rattling their sabers and doing anything and everything possible to provoke war with Russia. Mm-hmm. So, there's been numerous scenarios where they've attempted to demonize Russia and claim that Russia was pushing us towards war. And as Ron Paul pointed out, going back nearly 2 years now, the U.S. Congress essentially voted for war by giving the executive branch full authorization to do whatever it saw fit in terms of opposing Russia and supposedly thwarting Russia's geopolitical ambitions, when, of course, the actual truth is that things are reversed here. Russia has been extremely restrained in its actions, and the West has simply been provoking it again and again and again, with the example of Turkey shooting down the Russian jet being one of the most flagrant examples.
For my last question, when this entire system comes down, how long is it going to last? I mean, a lot of people talk about the crash. They talk about, it's going to happen. But how long is this going to last where people are going to feel the destruction of the economy?
Well, again, it's, you're getting into major fears, because if there's no way to survive the current scenario in any sort of reasonably healthy form, then almost anything is possible. And the most important dynamic is whether or not the current crime syndicate system remains in place after this crash. Mm-hmm. Will the people finally rise up off their couches, shake off their apathy, and get out into the streets and demand change? Or will they simply sit in their homes and, like serfs, and sulk and feel sorry for themselves and simply wait for the next paradigm of corruption to be inflicted upon them? And the point is, if we don't get rid of the current hierarchy of crime, then what we're faced with is the same system of oppression above us, but with our economies already having been absolutely destroyed. And of course, that scenario, we have a term for that as well. It's called third world. And if that is the scenario where we're headed, where we lose everything except for the current crime syndicate system that's sitting over top of us, there may never be a recovery in our lifetimes. This may be the permanent devolution of the West over any sort of any sort of short or medium term scenario, and it may be our distant descendants who are going to be the ones to try to bring us back to where we were once before.
Jeff, thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people get in touch with you or see your work?
My site is bullionbullscanada.com, and it's been in operation since the beginning of 2009. And I also do a lot of outside writing. Currently, my number one source is sprottmoney.com. They're a financial investment company in Canada, and one of the few financial investment companies that's willing to tell people the truth about what's going on here, which is why I feel very privileged to be able to work with them. And then beyond that, as you mentioned, my work is seen at various sites around the alternative media. I no longer have the same mainstream access I once had. Apparently, I'm not considered welcome and desirable by the mainstream media any longer for some reason. But like I say, people can see me at various places, and I hope they continue to follow my work in the future.
Jeff, once again, thank you very much for coming on the Spotlight.
My pleasure.